My name is Joaquin Herrera, and I'm a land surveyor who survived the first 127 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted, I thought my biggest problem was measuring property lines. I was wrong, dead wrong. Within weeks, I went from mapping suburban lots to mapping the boundaries between life and death, using my surveying tools to keep my group alive, while hostile survivors hunted us through the frozen ruins of Boulder, Colorado. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Herrera, and I'm speaking to you from what used to be the Boulder Public Library in Colorado. It's day 127 since the eruption, and the thermometer outside hasn't read above freezing in 3 months. The last time I saw the sun clearly was October 15th, 2024. That was the day everything changed. Right now, I'm sitting next to my surveying equipment. These tools used to help me measure property lines for suburban developments and commercial lots. Now they're the reason I'm still alive. My transit level, my measuring chains, my field notebooks filled with precise coordinates. They're not just instruments anymore. They're survival tools. Every measurement I take now is about life and death, not property values. Let me tell you how a normal Tuesday morning turned into the end of the world as we knew it. Because what happened that day taught me that everything I thought I knew about reading the landscape was completely wrong. October 15th started like any other workday. I was 20 minutes into my drive to the Henderson property outside Boulder, windows down, enjoying what I thought would be another routine boundary survey. The morning air was crisp but comfortable, typical Colorado autumn weather. I had my coffee, my equipment loaded in the back of my truck, and a full day of measurements ahead of me. The Henderson job was straightforward. New property owners wanted to verify their lot lines before putting up a fence. Simple work, the kind I'd done thousands of times over my 12 years as a licensed land surveyor. I've been mapping Colorado terrain since I graduated from Colorado State with my surveying engineering degree. The landscape had become my office, my sanctuary, and honestly, my teacher. Every ridge, every slope, every drainage pattern told a story if you knew how to read it. I always prided myself on reading the landscape, understanding how water flowed, where the stable ground was, predicting where problems might develop over time. Good surveying is about seeing what others miss and preparing for what's coming. That morning, I thought I had it all figured out. Turns out I was only looking at ground level. I pulled onto the Henderson property at exactly 8:30 in the morning. The lot sat on a gentle slope with good southern exposure, decent soil composition from what I could see. Perfect for the kind of residential development Boulder was known for. I started unpacking my equipment with the same methodical precision I'd developed over the years. Transit level first, then the measuring chains, stakes, and field notebook. Everything had its place and purpose. My routine was sacred. Set up the tripod, level the instrument, take initial readings to establish my baseline. I'd learned early in my career that accuracy started with preparation. Every measurement built on the previous one, creating a web of precise coordinates that defined legal boundaries. Property lines might seem like invisible concepts to most people, but to me, they were as real and permanent as mountains. That's what I thought anyway. Around 9:15, while I was taking my third measurement point, my phone started buzzing. Emergency alert. I glanced at the screen, expecting the usual flash flood warning or severe weather update. We got those constantly in Colorado, but this alert was different. Statewide emergency. All residents advised to monitor local news immediately. I kept working. Emergency alerts went off for everything these days. Missing children, severe weather, even test broadcasts that served no purpose except to annoy people during their morning commute. I figured whatever it was, it could wait until I finished this measurement series. But the alerts kept coming. Every 5 minutes, another buzz. Another warning. By 10 o'clock, my phone had received 7 different emergency notifications. That was unusual, even for Colorado's aggressive alert system. I decided to check the radio in my truck. The moment I turned it on, I knew something was seriously wrong. Every station, AM and FM, was carrying the same emergency broadcast. The words coming through my speakers made no sense at first. Yellowstone, massive eruption, volcanic emergency, ash cloud, evacuation recommendations for multiple states. I stood there next to my truck, listening to reports that sounded like they belonged in a disaster movie, not a Tuesday morning in Colorado. Reporters were talking about the Yellowstone supervolcano, something I'd heard about in geology classes but never really considered a real threat. Apparently, it had erupted at approximately 4:30 that morning. The ash cloud was already moving east, carried by prevailing winds. Aircraft grounded nationwide. Interstate highways in Montana and Wyoming closed due to ash accumulation. My first instinct was disbelief. I'd surveyed land around smaller volcanic areas in the past. Even active volcanoes were usually more of a long-term geological concern than an immediate crisis. The idea that something hundreds of miles away could affect my work day in Boulder seemed absurd. Then I looked west toward the mountains. The sky was wrong. Not storm cloud wrong, but something else entirely. The horizon had this sickly yellow-gray color that reminded me of old sepia photographs. Like someone had drained all the blue right out of the world and replaced it with something unnatural. I'd been working outdoors for over a decade, in every weather condition Colorado could produce. I'd never seen anything like this. I packed my equipment with unusual speed. My surveyor training had taught me to always have an exit strategy, to know exactly where I was and how to get back to safety. Something told me that getting back to Boulder quickly was more important than finishing the Henderson boundary survey. I loaded my gear with the same methodical care I always used, but faster. Transit level in its padded case, chains coiled properly, stakes bundled and secured. Even in crisis, precision mattered. The drive back to Boulder took 45 minutes. During that time, the radio reports got progressively worse. The ash cloud was moving faster than initially predicted. Eastern Colorado was now in the projected path. Residents were advised to stay indoors, seal windows and doors, avoid unnecessary travel. The governor was declaring a state of emergency. What disturbed me most was how quickly the situation was evolving. In my line of work, geological changes happen slowly. Mountain building, erosion, even landslides developed over time periods you could measure and predict. This felt chaotic, unpredictable, dangerous in ways I wasn't trained for. By the time I reached my apartment building, the western sky looked like the inside of an old furnace. Orange-gray, thick, oppressive. The air smelled different too, metallic, with an underlying chemical burn that made my throat itch. I'd never experienced anything like it. My apartment was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, typical Boulder housing. Efficient, well-built, with good insulation and modern heating. I'd chosen it partly because of the location. Close to downtown, easy access to the highways I needed for work, walking distance to most services I used regularly. The kind of practical decision a surveyor makes based on logistics and efficiency. I spent that first evening monitoring news reports and making lists. My surveyor brain kicked in automatically. I started calculating distances, wind patterns, resource requirements. If the ash cloud reached Boulder, how long would it affect air quality? If transportation was disrupted, how long could local supply chains function? If power systems were stressed, what backup options existed? I also made a decision that probably saved my life. I packed my surveying equipment in waterproof cases and stored them in my bedroom closet. Something told me that precise navigation was going to matter more than ever, even though I couldn't explain why. The instruments represented thousands of dollars of investment and years of professional expertise. They deserved protection. More importantly, they represented knowledge. Every surveyor develops an intimate understanding of their local area. Property boundaries, elevation changes, drainage patterns, soil composition, access routes. I'd been mapping the boulder area for 12 years. I knew where the stable ground was, where water collected, how different areas responded to weather stress. That knowledge felt suddenly valuable in ways I'd never considered. The first ash began falling around 8 o'clock that evening. It looked like snow, but it wasn't. The particles were finer, more persistent, and they burned when you accidentally inhaled them. I made the mistake of stepping outside to collect a sample, thinking my scientific curiosity was more important than the health warnings on every radio station. The burning sensation in my throat lasted for hours. This wasn't regular atmospheric dust or pollution. This was volcanic ash, full of silica particles and chemical compounds that human lungs weren't designed to process. Every breath was a reminder that the air itself had become hostile. I sealed my apartment as thoroughly as possible. Plastic sheeting over windows, towels under door frames, tape around any gaps I could identify. My surveying background had taught me to think systematically about structural integrity and environmental protection. I approached the ash threat like a construction problem, identifying vulnerabilities and addressing them methodically. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours listening to radio reports and taking notes. The ash cloud was larger than anyone had initially predicted. It was affecting weather patterns across multiple states. Transportation systems were shutting down faster than emergency services could respond. Food distribution networks were being disrupted. Power grids in some areas were failing due to ash accumulation on transmission equipment. The government response sounded coordinated but overwhelmed. Emergency shelters were being established, but they were filling quickly. Hospitals were seeing increased respiratory cases. The National Guard was being deployed to assist with evacuation and supply distribution. Standard disaster response protocols, but on a scale that stretched resources beyond normal capacity. What worried me most were the long-term projections. Geological experts were talking about extended atmospheric effects, reduced sunlight, altered weather patterns, potential agricultural disruption. The phrase volcanic winter kept appearing in news reports. Scientists were making cautious predictions about temperature drops and seasonal changes that could last months or even years. By morning, my car was buried under 3 inches of gray powder. The ash had accumulated faster than anyone predicted, and it wasn't stopping. Weather reports showed more volcanic activity at Yellowstone, with additional ash emissions expected. The initial eruption had been massive, but it wasn't finished. I spent the second day conducting what I mentally called a resource survey of my immediate area. Using the systematic approach I developed for property assessment, I mapped every food source, water access point, medical facility, and supply store within walking distance of my apartment. If transportation remained disrupted, local resources would become crucial. The grocery stores were chaos. By 10 in the morning, most shelves were empty. People were buying everything they could carry, with no apparent planning or strategy. I watched neighbors argue over canned goods, while I was mentally calculating caloric requirements and storage logistics. My surveying background had taught me to think in terms of long-term planning and resource management. Most people seemed to be responding emotionally rather than strategically. I bought what I could, focusing on non-perishable items with high caloric density and long storage life. Canned proteins, dried goods, basic medical supplies. Nothing fancy, just survival fundamentals. I also purchased additional batteries, flashlights, and a small camping stove. If power systems failed, basic heating and lighting would become critical. The real snow started on October 20th. In Colorado, October snow wasn't unusual, but this was different. The temperatures were dropping faster than seasonal norms, and the snow wasn't melting during the day. Weather reports confirmed what I was seeing. Average temperatures were running 15 to 20 degrees below normal, and the trend was accelerating. Meteorologists were explaining the connection between volcanic ash and temperature reduction. The particles in the atmosphere were blocking solar radiation, creating a cooling effect similar to nuclear winter scenarios. What had started as a regional disaster was becoming a global climate event. Local infrastructure was starting to show stress. Power outages became more frequent as utility systems struggled with increased heating demand and ash-related equipment problems. Internet service became unreliable. Cell phone networks were overwhelmed. The communication systems we'd all taken for granted were failing when we needed them most. I made another decision that proved crucial. I started keeping detailed written records of everything I observed: weather conditions, resource availability, infrastructure status, social dynamics. My surveying training had emphasized the importance of accurate documentation. In a changing environment, having reliable data could mean the difference between good decisions and fatal mistakes. By October 25th, the situation had clearly moved beyond temporary disruption into long-term crisis. News reports were using terms like extended emergency and indefinite duration. Government officials were talking about adaptation strategies rather than recovery timelines. The vocabulary itself revealed how dramatically expectations were changing. My apartment building's heating system was struggling. Built for normal Colorado winters, it wasn't designed for the extended below-freezing temperatures we were experiencing in October. Other residents were complaining about inadequate heat, and utility bills were skyrocketing as people desperately tried to stay warm. I started making contingency plans. If the heating system failed completely, which apartments would be most defensible? Which locations had the best access to water and emergency exits? Which neighbors had useful skills or resources? My surveying mindset was shifting from property assessment to survival planning. The social dynamics in the building were changing too. People who had barely acknowledged each other before were suddenly interested in cooperation and resource sharing. Crisis has a way of breaking down normal social boundaries and creating new alliances based on practical necessity rather than convenience. I met Sarah Chen, a retired elementary school teacher who lived in the apartment below mine. She had teaching experience, which meant organizational skills and the ability to work with groups under pressure. Mike Rodriguez was an electrician who understood power systems and basic infrastructure repair. Janet Walsh had worked as a nurse before retiring, giving her medical knowledge that could prove invaluable. These relationships weren't forming out of social interest. They were survival partnerships based on complementary skills and shared resource needs. My surveying expertise was becoming valuable currency in these negotiations. I knew the local area better than anyone, understood structural engineering principles, and had equipment that could prove useful in unexpected ways. By November 1st, 2 weeks after the eruption, it was clear that this wasn't a temporary emergency that would resolve itself quickly. The ash was still falling intermittently. Temperatures continued dropping. Supply chains remained disrupted. Government services were operating in crisis mode, focused on basic emergency response rather than normal civic functions. Most importantly, there was no clear endpoint. Unlike hurricanes or floods or other natural disasters, this volcanic event had no predictable duration. We were living in an open-ended crisis that could continue for months or years. That realization changed everything about how we needed to think and plan. I started treating Boulder like a job site that needed comprehensive surveying and assessment. Every day, I walked different routes through the city, documenting changes in infrastructure, resource availability, and population patterns. Some areas were being abandoned as people left for warmer climates or joined family elsewhere. Other neighborhoods were becoming more densely populated as people consolidated resources and sought safety in numbers. My professional training was proving more relevant than I'd ever imagined. Property surveying is fundamentally about understanding how land can be used most effectively, identifying potential problems, and creating accurate documentation for future reference. Those same skills were directly applicable to survival planning in a crisis environment. The unmarked government facility I'd surveyed the previous summer kept coming back to my thoughts. It had been an unusual job, contracted through a series of intermediaries rather than direct government contact. The location was remote. The buildings were clearly designed for specialized purposes, and there had been no public records or documentation associated with the survey work. At the time, I'd assumed it was some kind of research facility or storage depot. Government agencies contracted private surveyors regularly for various projects. But now, with infrastructure failing and supply systems disrupted, I was wondering if that facility might have been designed for exactly the kind of extended emergency we were experiencing. The coordinates were in my private notebooks. Precise measurements, structural assessments, access route documentation. Information that could prove valuable if that facility contained emergency supplies or communication equipment. But approaching it could also be dangerous, especially if it was occupied by people who might view outsiders as threats rather than potential allies. By November 10th, my apartment building's heating system was failing regularly. The landlord had stopped returning calls, and utility services were becoming increasingly unreliable. Other residents were talking about leaving Boulder entirely, heading south to warmer climates or east to areas less affected by the ash cloud. I made a different choice. I started identifying buildings in Boulder that would be more suitable for long-term occupancy during extended cold weather. Structures with good insulation, multiple heat sources, defensible positions, and access to necessary resources. The Boulder Public Library kept appearing at the top of my assessment lists. The library was built with solid brick construction and efficient heating systems. It had multiple floors, which provided options for consolidating living spaces in the most energy-efficient areas. The building included public restrooms with reliable plumbing, large open spaces that could accommodate groups, and thousands of books that could serve as insulation material or, in desperate circumstances, fuel for heating. Most importantly, the library was a public building that most people would overlook as a residential option. It wasn't a house or apartment, so it wouldn't attract attention from other people looking for shelter. But it had all the infrastructure necessary to support a small group of people through an extended emergency. I shared this assessment with Sarah, Mike, and Janet. They were facing the same heating problems in their apartments, and they'd reached similar conclusions about the need for alternative shelter. We started meeting regularly to discuss options and plan for the possibility that our current living situations would become unsustainable. These planning sessions felt like the coordination meetings I'd participated in for large surveying projects. Multiple people with different expertise, working together to solve complex logistical problems. The difference was that instead of planning property development, we were planning survival. Mike's electrical knowledge was crucial for understanding which buildings had the most reliable power systems. Janet's medical background helped us think about sanitation and health requirements for group living. Sarah's teaching experience provided insights into group dynamics and resource management. My surveying skills contributed site assessment and strategic planning capabilities. By November 15th, we'd made our decision. The library represented our best option for safe, sustainable shelter during what was clearly going to be an extended crisis. The next question was how to gain access without attracting unwanted attention or legal consequences. Under normal circumstances, breaking into a public building would be unthinkable. But these weren't normal circumstances. The city government was operating in emergency mode, focused on basic services rather than property protection. Police resources were stretched thin, dealing with more serious crimes and public safety issues. The library had been closed to public access since October 25, due to heating costs and staff shortages. We weren't planning to damage or steal anything. We were planning to use public space for its intended purpose, providing community benefit during a crisis. The legal and ethical justification was clear, even if the methods were unconventional. But first, we needed detailed intelligence about the building's current status, security systems, and structural condition. That's where my surveying expertise became essential. I could assess the building professionally, identify the best access points, and create accurate floor plans for our group's use. On November 20th, I conducted a comprehensive exterior survey of the Boulder Public Library. I brought my full complement of professional equipment, approaching the task with the same systematic methodology I'd use for any commercial property assessment. To outside observers, I looked like a contractor or city employee conducting routine building inspection work. The building was even better than I'd hoped. Solid construction, multiple access points, excellent sight lines for monitoring surrounding areas, and clear evidence that city services were still maintaining basic utilities. The heating system was operational, though probably running on reduced schedule. The structural integrity was excellent, with no visible damage from ash accumulation or weather stress. Most importantly, the building was clearly unoccupied and largely unmonitored. Security consisted of basic door locks and standard alarm systems, but there was no evidence of regular patrol or surveillance activity. The city was obviously prioritizing more critical infrastructure and services. I spent 3 hours conducting measurements and creating detailed floor plans. Every room, every entrance, every utility connection. By the time I finished, I had enough information to plan our occupation with professional precision. That evening, I met with Sarah, Mike, and Janet to present my findings. We spent 2 hours reviewing floor plans, discussing logistical requirements, and planning our transition from individual apartments to group shelter. The conversation felt like a construction project meeting, except we were planning to build a survival community rather than a commercial development. Our timeline was accelerating. My apartment building's heating had failed completely 2 days earlier. Sarah's building was having similar problems. Mike's electrical work was becoming dangerous as building systems deteriorated beyond safe operating parameters. Janet's medical supplies were dwindling, and she was seeing increased respiratory problems among residents who couldn't properly seal their living spaces against ash infiltration. We set November 25th as our target date for moving into the library. That gave us 5 days to prepare supplies, plan logistics, and mentally transition from individual survival to group cooperation. The decision felt momentous and practical at the same time. I had never imagined that my surveying career would prepare me for breaking into public buildings and organizing survival communities. But every skill I'd developed over 12 years of professional practice was proving directly relevant to our current situation. Reading terrain, understanding structural systems, creating accurate documentation, planning complex projects, coordinating with other professionals. The tools of my trade were becoming the tools of survival. My measuring chains, which had spent years defining property boundaries, would soon be used for safety lines in zero visibility conditions. My transit level, designed for precise elevation measurements, would become essential for monitoring our surroundings and identifying potential threats. My field notebooks, filled with technical surveys, would document our survival strategies and resource management decisions. Property lines had always seemed permanent to me, legal boundaries that defined ownership and responsibility in predictable, stable ways. Now I was learning that the most important boundaries were the ones between life and death, safety and danger, cooperation and conflict. And those boundaries were shifting constantly, requiring the same careful measurement and documentation I'd always provided for land surveys. The world was teaching me that nothing was as permanent as I'd believed. Not property lines, not infrastructure, not social systems, not even the climate itself. But the skills of careful observation, precise measurement, and systematic planning were proving more valuable than ever. As I prepared for what was essentially a new phase of my life, I kept thinking about measurement and accuracy. Every decision we made would need to be based on reliable information and careful analysis. Every resource calculation would need to be precise, because mistakes could be fatal. Every boundary we established would need clear definition and consistent enforcement. I was about to learn that surveying property lines had been just practice for surveying the boundaries between civilization and chaos. November 25th arrived faster than any of us expected. That morning, I woke up in my freezing apartment for the last time, knowing that by evening we'd either be safely established in the Boulder Public Library or facing consequences I didn't want to consider. The temperature outside had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, and my apartment's heating system had been completely dead for 4 days. I packed my surveying equipment first, wrapping each instrument in protective padding before placing them in waterproof cases. The transit level, measuring chains, stakes, field notebooks, and calculation tools represented not just my professional identity, but our group's best chance for survival. These instruments had helped me navigate 12 years of surveying work, and now they would help us navigate something far more dangerous. Sarah, Mike, and Janet met me at 7:30 that morning in the lobby of my apartment building. We'd spent the previous week coordinating our supply lists and timing, but seeing everyone together with their packed belongings made the reality of our situation unavoidable. We were about to abandon our normal lives and break into a public building to survive an indefinite crisis. The walk to the library took 23 minutes through streets that looked like abandoned movie sets. Most businesses had been closed for weeks. Many houses showed no signs of recent occupancy. The few people we encountered moved quickly, heads down, focused entirely on their own survival rather than community interaction. Boulder had transformed from a vibrant college town into something resembling a disaster zone. During that walk, I used my measuring chains for the first time in their new capacity, not for property surveying, but as safety lines connecting our group in the reduced visibility caused by blowing ash and snow. The same precision tools that had defined legal boundaries were now defining the boundary between staying together and losing each other in conditions that could quickly become fatal. Mike handled the actual breaking and entering. His electrical background included knowledge of building security systems, and he'd spent the previous day observing the library's alarm setup. The building's security was designed for normal circumstances, not extended emergency conditions. Most importantly, the monitoring systems were clearly not being actively maintained by city services that had more pressing priorities. We gained entry through a maintenance door on the building's north side, away from Main Street visibility. Mike disabled the alarm system by disconnecting power to the control panel rather than trying to bypass electronic components that might trigger backup alerts. Simple, direct, and effective. Within 15 minutes, we were inside the Boulder Public Library with no evidence of external detection. The building was everything my survey had indicated. Solid construction, functional heating, adequate space for our group, and excellent strategic positioning. More importantly, it felt secure in ways our individual apartments never could. Thick walls, multiple floors, clear sight lines to monitor approaches, and enough internal space to establish different areas for sleeping, cooking, storage, and group meetings. I immediately began the process of mapping our new environment with the same systematic approach I'd use for any surveying project. Room dimensions, utility locations, potential security vulnerabilities, sight lines for observation, optimal positioning for defensive arrangements. The difference was that instead of creating property boundary documentation, I was creating survival infrastructure plans. My field notebooks, which had recorded thousands of routine property surveys, started filling with entirely different kinds of measurements. Food storage calculations, heating efficiency assessments, security rotation schedules, resource inventory tracking. The same attention to detail and systematic documentation, but applied to problems I'd never imagined addressing professionally. Within our first week in the library, we established routines that felt surprisingly similar to construction project management. Daily planning meetings, task assignments based on individual expertise, progress reviews, and problem-solving sessions when unexpected issues arose. Sarah's teaching background proved invaluable for group organization. Mike's electrical knowledge kept our power systems functional. Janet's medical training helped us establish sanitation and health protocols. My surveying skills became the foundation for almost every decision we made. Which areas of the building were most energy efficient for winter occupancy? How to position furniture and supplies for optimal space utilization? Where to establish observation posts for monitoring external activity? How to create accurate inventory systems for tracking our resources over time? The measuring chains that had spent years defining property boundaries became essential safety equipment for any movement outside the library. During ash storms or snow squalls, visibility could drop to less than 10 feet. The chains provided reliable connection between team members, ensuring nobody became separated and lost during supply runs or reconnaissance missions. But it was my transit level that proved most valuable for our long-term security. The instrument's telescopic capability allowed detailed observation of surrounding areas from our second-floor windows. I could monitor other buildings for signs of occupation, track movement patterns in nearby streets, and identify potential threats or opportunities long before they reached our immediate area. Through that scope, I started noticing details that disturbed me. Other survivor groups were definitely active in Boulder, but their behavior patterns suggested organization and planning that went beyond desperate improvisation. These weren't just random people struggling to survive. They moved with purpose, coordination, and equipment that indicated significant resources and leadership. During our second week in the library, I documented at least 3 different groups operating in our general area. One group had established some kind of base in the former sporting goods store, 6 blocks south of our position. Another group was systematically searching abandoned houses in the residential area north of downtown. A third group appeared to be monitoring city infrastructure, particularly utility and communication systems. What worried me most was how well-equipped these groups seemed to be. Through my surveying scope, I could see vehicles that appeared to be running despite the general transportation breakdown. People wearing coordinated cold-weather gear rather than improvised clothing. Communication equipment that suggested organized command structures rather than ad hoc cooperation. Mike noticed similar patterns during his electrical work around the building. Power grids in other areas of Boulder were being maintained or restored in ways that didn't match official city emergency services. Someone was keeping lights on and heating systems functional in specific locations, using technical knowledge and resources that exceeded what most survivor groups should reasonably possess. Janet's medical background contributed another disturbing observation. The respiratory problems she'd been treating among residents before we moved to the library weren't randomly distributed. People in certain areas of Boulder were experiencing more severe symptoms than others, suggesting either better air filtration in some locations or deliberate exposure differences that didn't match natural ash distribution patterns. Sarah's organizational instincts identified the pattern that connected all our separate observations. The groups we were monitoring weren't competing with each other for the same resources. They seemed to be operating according to some kind of coordinated plan, with different responsibilities and territorial assignments. That level of organization required advanced planning and leadership structures that couldn't have developed spontaneously after the eruption. By December 1st, we'd reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Some of the survivor groups in Boulder had been prepared for this crisis in ways that suggested advanced knowledge or at least contingency planning that went far beyond normal emergency preparedness. They weren't just adapting to unexpected circumstances. They were implementing predetermined strategies. This realization completely changed how we approached our own survival planning. We were no longer just dealing with natural disaster aftermath and resource scarcity. We were potentially dealing with organized groups that viewed other survivors as competitors or threats rather than potential allies. Our security planning needed to account for deliberate human threats, not just environmental dangers. I started using my surveying equipment to create detailed security assessments rather than just resource inventories. Sight lines for defensive positioning, escape route planning, camouflage and concealment strategies, early warning systems for detecting approaching groups. My professional training in site analysis was becoming military-style tactical planning. The measuring chains became tripwire components for perimeter security around the library. My stakes, normally used for marking survey points, became anchors for defensive barriers and early warning systems. Field notebooks documented guard rotation schedules, threat assessment protocols, and emergency response procedures rather than property boundary calculations. Most significantly, I started seriously considering the unmarked government facility I'd surveyed the previous summer. The coordinates were in my private notebooks, along with detailed structural assessments and access route documentation. If organized groups were operating with resources and knowledge that exceeded normal civilian capabilities, that facility might represent either valuable supplies or dangerous territory that was already under someone else's control. The facility had been designed for specialized purposes I hadn't fully understood during the original survey work. Remote location, hardened construction, underground components, communication infrastructure that seemed excessive for routine government operations. At the time, I'd assumed it was some kind of research or storage facility. Now I was wondering if it had been designed specifically for extended emergency scenarios. But investigating the facility would require leaving our secure position at the library and traveling through territory that might be monitored or controlled by other groups. The risk assessment was complex, involving not just environmental dangers, but potential hostile encounters with people who might view our knowledge as threatening or valuable enough to fight for. During our third week in the library, external pressures started escalating in ways that forced us to make increasingly difficult decisions. Food supplies throughout Boulder were becoming critically scarce. The organized groups we'd been monitoring were expanding their territories and becoming more aggressive about resource control. Weather conditions were deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted, making outdoor activity increasingly dangerous. Mike's electrical monitoring revealed that power systems in our area were being deliberately targeted or abandoned, isolating the library from city services that were still functioning in other parts of Boulder. Someone was systematically cutting communication and utility connections to buildings that weren't under their direct control. Janet started treating injuries that clearly resulted from conflicts between survivor groups rather than environmental accidents. People were showing up at our location with wounds that indicated organized violence, not desperate individual encounters. The social breakdown was accelerating beyond simple resource competition into something resembling territorial warfare. Sarah's community organizing experience helped her recognize the pattern. Boulder was being divided into zones of control by groups that had resources, weapons, and leadership structures that couldn't have developed naturally in 6 weeks of crisis. The fragmentation wasn't random. It was strategic, deliberate, and coordinated in ways that suggested advanced planning and external support. My surveying observations confirmed what everyone else was seeing from their different perspectives. The groups operating around us weren't just surviving. They were implementing some kind of predetermined strategy for controlling territory and resources during exactly the kind of extended emergency we were experiencing. That realization forced us to confront questions we'd been avoiding. How long could we maintain our position at the library without becoming involved in larger conflicts over territorial control? Whether our knowledge of the unmarked government facility represented a valuable asset or a dangerous liability in negotiations with other groups. How to balance our desire for peaceful survival with the practical necessity of defending ourselves against increasingly organized threats. On December 15th, we had our first direct contact with one of the organized groups we'd been monitoring. 3 people approached the library under what appeared to be a flag of truce, requesting conversation rather than attempting infiltration or attack. The encounter was polite, professional, and deeply unsettling in ways that took me hours to fully understand. The group's leader introduced herself as Commander Patricia Williams, claiming to represent a coalition of survivor communities working to establish stability and resource distribution throughout the Boulder area. Her companions were clearly military or law enforcement personnel, with equipment and bearing that indicated significant training and organizational support. Williams knew details about our group that should have been impossible to obtain through casual observation. She knew my professional background, Mike's electrical expertise, Janet's medical training, and Sarah's teaching experience. She knew we'd been occupying the library for 3 weeks and had detailed information about our daily routines and resource management strategies. Most disturbing, she knew about my surveying work on the unmarked government facility. She didn't mention it directly, but her questions about my previous projects and knowledge of local infrastructure made it clear that our conversation wasn't accidental. She was specifically interested in my professional expertise and the information I might possess about locations and resources that weren't publicly documented. The conversation lasted 47 minutes and covered topics ranging from resource sharing agreements to territorial boundary definitions, to potential cooperation in security matters. Williams presented their coalition as a reasonable alternative to chaotic individual survival, offering protection and resource access in exchange for participation in organized community development. But the subtext was unmistakable. Cooperation was strongly encouraged, and non-cooperation might result in consequences that weren't explicitly stated but were clearly implied. The choice between joining their coalition and maintaining our independence wasn't really a choice at all. It was an ultimatum presented in polite, reasonable language. After Williams and her companions left, we spent the rest of that evening analyzing every detail of the encounter and trying to understand its implications for our situation. The conversation had revealed that our independence was temporary, and that our knowledge was valuable enough to attract attention from groups with resources and organization we couldn't match. My surveying expertise, particularly my knowledge of the unmarked government facility, had clearly become a strategic asset in conflicts I didn't fully understand. The coordinates and structural assessments in my private notebooks weren't just professional documentation anymore. They were intelligence that multiple groups might be willing to fight for. We faced a series of impossible choices. Joining Williams' coalition would provide security and resources, but would also require surrendering our autonomy and potentially putting my specialized knowledge at the service of people whose ultimate goals weren't clear. Rejecting their offer would maintain our independence, but would also make us targets for groups that had demonstrated sophisticated organization and planning capabilities. Most importantly, we needed to make our decision quickly. Williams had given us 72 hours to consider their proposal, but her tone had made it clear that the deadline wasn't negotiable. We had 3 days to choose between cooperation and consequences that none of us wanted to contemplate. During those 3 days, I conducted the most detailed security assessment of my surveying career. Using every observation technique and analytical method I'd developed over 12 years of professional practice, I tried to understand exactly what we were facing and what options remained available to us. My transit level revealed increased activity around all the buildings controlled by Williams' coalition. Vehicle movements, personnel rotations, equipment positioning that suggested preparation for either expansion or defense. Whatever decision we made, it would take place in an environment where multiple groups were preparing for escalated conflict. The measuring chains I strung around our perimeter detected probe attempts by people testing our security arrangements and response protocols. Someone was gathering intelligence about our capabilities and defensive preparations, probably in preparation for forced cooperation if we rejected the voluntary alternative. My field notebooks filled with tactical assessments rather than property surveys. Escape route planning, supply cache calculations, communication protocol development, defensive position analysis. Every measurement technique I'd learned for civilian surveying was being adapted for survival planning in an increasingly militarized environment. On December 18th, the morning of our deadline, I made a discovery that changed everything about our situation and forced us to completely reconsider our options. While conducting routine perimeter observation through my transit level, I spotted movement at the unmarked government facility I'd surveyed months earlier. The facility wasn't abandoned. People were actively using it, with equipment and vehicles that clearly indicated ongoing operations rather than simple shelter seeking. Through my surveying scope, I could see communication antennas, vehicle maintenance activities, and personnel movements that suggested a significant organizational presence. Most importantly, the people at the facility were using some of the same equipment and following some of the same protocols I'd observed among Williams' coalition members. The connection was unmistakable. The unmarked government facility was somehow connected to the organized groups that were dividing Boulder into territorial zones. That realization completely reframed everything we'd been experiencing. The volcanic eruption and subsequent crisis weren't just natural disasters that had triggered social breakdown. They were apparently scenarios that some groups had prepared for in advance, using government resources and facilities that had been positioned specifically for extended emergency operations. My survey work on that facility the previous summer hadn't been routine commercial contracting. It had been intelligence gathering about a strategic location that was designed for exactly the kind of crisis we were experiencing. The coordinates and structural assessments in my notebooks weren't just professional documentation. They were classified information about a facility that was actively being used for crisis management and territorial control. Williams' interest in my expertise suddenly made complete sense. She didn't just want my knowledge about local terrain and infrastructure. She wanted my detailed documentation about a government facility that was central to whoever was really coordinating the organized response to the volcanic crisis. That discovery gave us leverage we hadn't realized we possessed, but it also made our situation far more dangerous than we'd understood. My surveying records contained information that multiple groups would consider valuable enough to fight for. We weren't just independent survivors trying to avoid territorial conflicts. We were potential intelligence assets in a larger struggle for control over crisis response resources. The deadline Williams had given us wasn't really about joining a survivor coalition. It was about gaining access to classified information that could determine which groups controlled the most valuable resources during an extended emergency. Our choice wasn't between cooperation and independence. It was between voluntary disclosure and forced extraction of information that had national security implications. On the evening of December 18th, with 6 hours remaining before Williams' deadline, I made the decision that would determine our survival strategy for everything that followed. Instead of choosing between the options Williams had presented, I decided to use my knowledge of the government facility as a bargaining chip for establishing our own terms of engagement. My surveying expertise had always been about understanding how land could be used most effectively and identifying the true boundaries that determined value and control. Now I was about to apply those same skills to negotiating the boundaries between cooperation and resistance in a conflict that extended far beyond simple survival. The coordinates in my notebooks represented more than geographical positions. They represented power, leverage, and the possibility of maintaining our independence in an environment where independence was becoming increasingly impossible. But using that information would also make us permanent participants in struggles we'd hoped to avoid. I was about to learn that the most important property lines I'd ever surveyed were the boundaries between loyalty and survival, between cooperation and resistance, between the knowledge that could save us and the knowledge that could destroy us. The measurement tools that had defined my professional identity were about to become weapons in a conflict I was only beginning to understand. December 18th, 6 o'clock in the evening. William's deadline was approaching, and I had made my decision. Instead of accepting her ultimatum or rejecting it outright, I was going to use the one advantage we possessed that she didn't know we understood. My detailed knowledge of the unmarked government facility wasn't just information anymore. It was leverage. I called our group together in the library's main reading room, where we'd held all our important discussions since moving in. Sarah, Mike, and Janet deserved to understand what I'd discovered and what it meant for our survival strategy. The conversation we were about to have would determine whether we maintained any control over our future or became pawns in someone else's game. When I explained what I'd observed at the government facility through my transit level, the implications hit everyone immediately. We weren't dealing with random survivor groups that had organized themselves after the volcanic eruption. We were facing people who had been prepared for this exact scenario, using resources and facilities that had been positioned in advance for extended emergency operations. Mike's electrical background helped him understand the technical aspects of what I'd seen. The communication equipment and power systems at the facility weren't improvised survival technology. They were professional-grade installations designed for coordinated operations across multiple locations. Someone had invested serious resources in preparing for exactly the kind of infrastructure breakdown we were experiencing. Janet's medical training gave her insight into the health and logistics implications. The facility wasn't just a shelter or storage depot. It was designed to support significant numbers of people for extended periods, with medical capabilities that exceeded anything available to civilian survivor groups. The preparation level suggested advanced knowledge of both the timeline and severity of the crisis we were facing. Sarah's community organizing experience helped her recognize the political dimensions of our situation. The territorial divisions emerging in Boulder weren't random results of social breakdown. They were implementation of predetermined plans for crisis management and resource control. We were living through the execution of strategies that had been developed long before the Yellowstone eruption. Our discussion lasted 2 hours and covered every aspect of what we knew, what we suspected, and what we needed to decide before Williams returned for our answer. The fundamental question wasn't whether to cooperate with her coalition. It was whether to reveal what we knew about the government facility and use that information to negotiate better terms for our survival. I had detailed surveying records that Williams clearly wanted, but didn't know we possessed. Structural assessments, access routes, utility connections, security vulnerabilities, and precise coordinates for a facility that was obviously central to crisis operations in our region. That information gave us bargaining power, but using it would also make us permanent targets for anyone who wanted to control those resources. By 8 o'clock that evening, we'd reached consensus on our strategy. We would meet with Williams' group, but approach the conversation as negotiation rather than surrender. My surveying expertise would be our primary asset, but we would reveal information gradually and only in exchange for specific guarantees about our autonomy and security. The next morning, Williams returned with the same 2 companions as before, but their approach was noticeably different. Instead of the polite but intimidating tone of our first meeting, they seemed genuinely interested in productive conversation. Something had changed in their assessment of our value. though I couldn't identify what had triggered their shift in attitude. Williams opened the discussion by acknowledging that our group possessed skills and knowledge that could benefit their coalition in ways beyond simple resource sharing. She specifically mentioned my surveying expertise and asked whether I'd be willing to provide technical consultation on infrastructure and security projects in exchange for enhanced protection and resource access. I responded by explaining that my professional knowledge included information about locations and facilities that weren't publicly documented. I didn't mention the government facility directly, but I made it clear that my surveying records contained data that could be valuable for anyone interested in comprehensive resource management and territorial security during extended emergency conditions. Williams' reaction confirmed what I'd suspected. She knew about the facility, but she didn't have detailed technical information about its capabilities and vulnerabilities. Her questions became increasingly specific about my experience with government contracting and my knowledge of emergency infrastructure in the Boulder area. The negotiation that followed was the most important surveying project of my career, except instead of mapping property boundaries, I was defining the terms under which our group would maintain independence while providing technical consultation to people whose ultimate goals weren't entirely clear. I offered to share selected information from my surveying records in exchange for guaranteed autonomy for our group, continued occupation of the library, and access to medical supplies for Janet's treatment of other survivors. Williams countered with proposals for full integration into their coalition structure, which would provide greater security, but would also require complete disclosure of all my professional records. The back-and-forth continued for 3 hours, with both sides testing boundaries and exploring possibilities for cooperation that didn't require complete surrender of independence. My surveying training proved invaluable for understanding the strategic dimensions of what we were negotiating. Property disputes had taught me to identify underlying interests, evaluate long-term consequences, and find creative solutions that addressed everyone's essential needs. Eventually, we reached an agreement that satisfied our immediate survival requirements while preserving some control over our future decisions. I would provide technical consultation on infrastructure projects and security assessments. In exchange, our group would maintain independent status with guaranteed protection from other territorial disputes in the Boulder area. Most importantly, I would share information about specific locations and facilities on a case-by-case basis, with compensation and protection levels adjusted according to the value and sensitivity of the data being disclosed. My surveying records would remain under my control, but I would provide selected technical assistance as needed for coalition operations. The agreement represented compromise rather than victory for either side, but it established a framework for ongoing cooperation without complete subordination. Williams got access to expertise she needed for infrastructure planning. We got security and resources without surrendering our autonomy. Both sides retained leverage for future negotiations. But the real test of our agreement came 2 days later, when Williams returned with a specific request that revealed how desperate their situation had become despite their apparent organizational advantages. They needed detailed technical information about the unmarked government facility, and they needed it quickly because of developments that posed threats to all survivor groups in the Boulder area. Williams explained that their coalition had been monitoring radio communications from hostile groups operating out of Denver and Colorado Springs. These groups were better equipped and more aggressively organized than anything they'd encountered locally. Intelligence suggested that the Denver group was planning systematic expansion into the Boulder area, targeting facilities and resources that would give them strategic control over the entire region. The government facility I'd surveyed was apparently a primary target because of its communication capabilities and strategic location. Williams' coalition needed to secure the facility before the Denver group arrived, but they lacked detailed information about its layout, security systems, and defensive capabilities. My surveying records contained exactly the technical data they needed for successful operation. This request forced me to confront the full implications of my knowledge and the role it would play in conflicts that extended far beyond our local survival concerns. The coordinates and structural assessments in my notebooks weren't just valuable to Williams' coalition. They were strategic intelligence that could determine the outcome of territorial struggles across multiple regions. I spent that entire night reviewing my survey records from the government facility, trying to understand exactly what information I possessed and how it might be used by different groups with different objectives. The technical documentation was more comprehensive than I'd initially realized, including details about underground components, communication systems, and security arrangements that could prove decisive in any attempt to control the facility. My surveying work had always been about creating accurate documentation for future reference and planning. Now that documentation was becoming a weapon in conflicts where the stakes included control over resources that could determine survival for thousands of people across multiple communities. The decision I faced wasn't just about cooperation with Williams' coalition. It was about choosing sides in a larger struggle for territorial control during an extended crisis that might continue for years. My technical knowledge made neutrality impossible. Whatever choice I made would have consequences that extended far beyond our small group's immediate survival. On December 22nd, I made the decision that would define our role in everything that followed. I agreed to provide Williams with detailed technical information about the government facility, but only as part of a joint operation that would include our group as equal partners rather than subordinate consultants. My conditions were specific and non-negotiable. I would participate directly in any mission to secure the facility, using my surveying expertise to guide tactical planning and execution. My survey records would remain under my control, with information shared as needed for operational success, but not transferred to coalition leadership for independent use. Most importantly, our group would have equal voice in decisions about how the facility would be used once it was secured. We weren't just providing technical assistance. We were becoming stakeholders in whatever operations would be conducted from that location. Williams accepted my conditions after consultation with her leadership, but her agreement came with warnings about the risks we would be accepting. The mission to secure the government facility would involve direct confrontation with hostile groups that were better armed and more experienced in organized violence than anything we'd encountered in Boulder. The Denver group approaching our area wasn't composed of desperate survivors trying to find food and shelter. They were militarized organizations that had been conducting systematic territorial expansion since the volcanic eruption, using equipment and tactics that suggested professional military or law enforcement backgrounds. Our joint operation to secure the government facility would be our first direct involvement in the larger territorial conflicts that were reshaping Colorado during the extended crisis. Success would give us access to resources and communication capabilities that could ensure long-term survival. Failure would likely result in death or capture by groups that viewed other survivors as obstacles rather than potential allies. The tactical planning for our mission began immediately, using my surveying records as the foundation for understanding terrain, approaches, defensive positions, and potential vulnerabilities. My detailed structural assessments became the basis for entry strategies, room-clearing procedures, and security arrangements for holding the facility once it was captured. Mike's electrical expertise proved essential for understanding the facility's power systems and communication equipment. Janet's medical background helped us plan for casualties and establish field treatment protocols. Sarah's organizational skills coordinated logistics and supply requirements for an operation that might last several days. My measuring chains, which had started as property surveying tools and evolved into safety equipment for winter survival, became tactical coordination devices for maintaining unit cohesion during complex building operations. The same precision that had defined legal boundaries would now define operational boundaries between success and failure in our first military-style mission. Through my transit level, I conducted detailed reconnaissance of the government facility and surrounding terrain, documenting current activity levels, security arrangements, and potential approaches for our assault team. The people occupying the facility were clearly professionals, but my surveying records revealed vulnerabilities in their defensive positioning that could be exploited with proper planning and coordination. Most significantly, my original survey work had documented underground components and service tunnels that the current occupants might not be aware of or adequately defending. These access routes could provide tactical advantages that would offset our disadvantages in equipment and experience. The night before our mission, I reviewed every measurement, every calculation, every detail of the technical documentation that would guide our attempt to secure a government facility designed for exactly the kind of extended emergency operations we were planning to conduct. My surveying career had taught me that success required careful preparation, accurate information, and systematic execution of predetermined plans. Those same principles would determine whether our mission succeeded or whether we became casualties in a conflict that was expanding beyond anything we'd initially understood. The property lines I'd spent 12 years measuring had prepared me for mapping the boundaries between success and failure in the most important surveying project of my life. But instead of marking legal ownership, I would be using my expertise to define territorial control in a struggle where the stakes included survival for everyone we'd committed to protecting. On December 23rd, at 5:30 in the morning, our joint operation began. Williams' coalition contributed 12 people with military equipment and tactical experience. Our group provided technical intelligence and specialized knowledge about the target facility. Together, we represented the largest coordinated action any of us had attempted since the volcanic eruption began. The approach to the government facility took 2 hours through terrain that my surveying records had mapped in detail months earlier. Every elevation change, every sight line, every potential concealment position had been documented during my original survey work. That information proved invaluable for avoiding detection during our movement to assault positions. My measuring chains connected our assault team during the final approach, ensuring coordination and preventing separation in the pre-dawn darkness. The same tools that had measured suburban property lines were now measuring the distances between survival and failure in our first direct confrontation with hostile forces. Through my transit level, I confirmed that the facility's defenders were positioned exactly as my reconnaissance had indicated. Professional arrangement of security posts, but with gaps in coverage that my underground access routes could exploit. The technical knowledge in my surveying records was about to become the decisive factor in a conflict that would determine our group's survival and role in the larger territorial struggles reshaping Colorado. As we moved into final positions for what would be the most important mission of our lives, I realized that every measurement I'd ever taken had been preparation for this moment, when precision and accuracy would determine not just property ownership, but life and death for everyone depending on my expertise. The surveying tools that had defined my professional identity were about to define whether we would control our future or become victims of people who viewed knowledge as a weapon and territory, as something to be taken rather than shared. The assault on the government facility began at 6:15 that morning, and within the first 10 minutes, I realized that everything we thought we knew about the crisis was wrong. The people defending the facility weren't just well-equipped survivors or even organized military personnel. They were operating with technology and coordination that suggested preparation for this exact scenario going back years before the Yellowstone eruption. My surveying records had provided perfect intelligence about the facility's layout and vulnerabilities, but they hadn't prepared us for what we found inside. The underground components I documented during my original survey were far more extensive than the surface structures had indicated. This wasn't just an emergency shelter or communication post. It was a comprehensive command center designed to coordinate crisis operations across multiple states. The underground access tunnels that gave us tactical advantage during the assault led to levels of infrastructure I hadn't even known existed when I conducted the original survey work. Communication equipment that could reach locations across North America. Computer systems with databases containing detailed information about survivor populations, resource distributions, and territorial control throughout the entire region affected by the volcanic eruption. Most disturbing, the facility contained documentation that proved the government had advanced knowledge of the Yellowstone eruption timeline, not just geological monitoring that suggested possible future activity, but specific intelligence about timing, magnitude, and expected duration of the volcanic winter that followed. The crisis we'd been experiencing as a natural disaster was apparently something that had been anticipated and planned for by people with access to information the general public never received. Williams' reaction to these discoveries revealed that her coalition's knowledge was incomplete despite their apparent organizational advantages. She'd known about the facility's existence and general capabilities, but she hadn't understood the scope of the preparation or the level of coordination it represented. Our successful assault had given us access to intelligence that changed everyone's understanding of what we were really facing. The documentation we found included detailed maps showing similar facilities throughout Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and surrounding states. Each location was marked with current operational status, resource levels, and communication protocols. The network of emergency installations was far more comprehensive than anything any of us had imagined, representing a shadow infrastructure designed specifically for extended crisis management. My surveying expertise became essential for understanding the technical documentation and translating facility schematics into practical operational knowledge. The same skills I'd used for property assessment were now being applied to analyzing a classified government program that had been implementing crisis preparation strategies for years before the volcanic eruption occurred. Mike's electrical background helped him understand the communication systems and power infrastructure that connected our facility to the broader network. The equipment was military-grade, designed for reliable operation during exactly the kind of extended emergency conditions we were experiencing. Someone had invested enormous resources in preparing for scenarios that most people would have considered impossible or unlikely. Janet's medical training gave her insight into the health and logistics documentation we discovered. The facility had been stocked with medical supplies, food, and equipment calculated to support specific numbers of people for predetermined time periods. The preparation wasn't improvised emergency response. It was systematic implementation of detailed survival planning based on advanced knowledge of crisis duration and severity. Sarah's organizational experience helped her interpret the administrative documents that revealed how decisions were being made about resource distribution and territorial control. The crisis management wasn't chaotic government response to unexpected disaster. It was coordinated execution of predetermined strategies for maintaining continuity of operations during extended national emergency conditions. But the most shocking discovery came when we accessed the facility's communication logs and realized that the territorial conflicts we'd been experiencing in Boulder were part of a much larger pattern of organized struggle for control over crisis resources. The Denver group that Williams had warned us about wasn't just aggressive survivors. They were people who had been excluded from the official emergency network and were conducting systematic operations to capture facilities and resources they believed they deserved access to. The radio communications we monitored revealed that similar conflicts were occurring throughout the region, with different groups fighting for control over facilities, supplies, and territory, based on competing claims about authority and resource rights during the extended emergency. Our local survival struggles were actually part of a complex political and military situation that extended across multiple states. Most importantly, we learned that our successful capture of the government facility had made us players in conflicts that involved federal agencies, military units, civilian survivor groups, and what appeared to be private organizations with resources and capabilities that rivaled official government operations. Our small group's survival decisions were now part of strategic calculations being made by people with authority over resources that could affect thousands of survivors across the entire volcanic impact region. The intelligence we'd gained access to included detailed information about other survivor populations, their locations, resources, and organizational structures. Some groups were cooperating with official emergency management programs. Others were operating independently, trying to maintain autonomy while surviving extended crisis conditions. A third category consisted of organized groups that were actively opposing government control and establishing alternative territorial arrangements. Our position had become strategically significant because the facility we now controlled was a crucial communication and coordination node for the entire regional emergency network. Decisions made from our location could affect resource distribution, territorial boundaries, and cooperation agreements across multiple states. My surveying expertise had evolved from local technical consulting to participation in crisis management with national implications. But with that strategic importance came threats we hadn't anticipated when we planned our assault on the facility. The Denver group Williams had warned us about was apparently just one of several organizations that considered our facility a primary target for capture or destruction. Intelligence reports indicated coordinated operations being planned by groups with military equipment and professional tactical capabilities. During our second week of operation from the government facility, we made contact with survivor communities throughout Colorado and surrounding states. The communication equipment gave us access to information about conditions and developments across the entire region affected by the volcanic eruption. What we learned forced us to completely reassess our understanding of both the scope of the crisis and the timeline for recovery. The volcanic winter was lasting longer and having more severe effects than any public announcements had indicated. Agricultural systems throughout the northern United States and southern Canada had been completely disrupted. Transportation networks remained largely non-functional. Power grids in many areas had failed beyond repair with available resources. The crisis wasn't temporary disruption that would resolve itself in months. It was permanent change that would require years of adaptation and reconstruction. More disturbing, we learned that survivor populations were declining faster than official estimates had projected. Respiratory diseases, malnutrition, exposure, and violence were combining to create mortality rates that threatened the viability of many communities. Some areas that had initially maintained substantial populations were now reporting abandonment or collapse of organized survival efforts. The intelligence also revealed that international assistance was not coming. Other countries were dealing with their own climate disruption and agricultural failures caused by the volcanic ash. The global food system had been seriously damaged, creating resource competition that made international cooperation unlikely. North American survivor communities were essentially on their own for recovery efforts that might take decades to complete. This information completely changed our strategic planning and forced us to think about long-term sustainability rather than short-term survival. The resources we controlled weren't just valuable for getting through the winter. They were potentially crucial for maintaining viable communities through years of reduced agricultural productivity and infrastructure reconstruction. My surveying records took on new significance as documentation of pre-crisis infrastructure that could guide reconstruction efforts. The property boundaries, utility systems, transportation networks, and resource locations I'd mapped during my professional career represented knowledge about how the region had functioned before the volcanic eruption. That information could be invaluable for planning sustainable communities adapted to post-volcanic conditions. But our strategic position also made us targets for groups that viewed resource control as a zero-sum competition, where cooperation meant weakness and sharing meant vulnerability. The facility we controlled contained supplies, equipment, and intelligence that could determine survival prospects for thousands of people. Other groups were willing to fight for access to those resources rather than negotiate sharing arrangements. On January 8th, our intelligence monitoring detected the first concrete evidence of coordinated assault planning by hostile groups. Radio intercepts indicated that at least 3 separate organizations were coordinating operations to capture government facilities throughout the region. Our location was specifically mentioned as a high-priority target because of its communication capabilities and strategic position. The Denver group that Williams had originally warned us about was apparently coordinating with organizations from Colorado Springs and Cheyenne, Wyoming. Together, they represented combined forces with military equipment, tactical experience, and intelligence about government facility operations that could overwhelm our defensive capabilities despite the advantages provided by my surveying knowledge of the terrain and infrastructure. Williams' coalition had grown substantially since our successful capture of the government facility, but the expanded organization also created new vulnerabilities and political complications. Different survivor groups had different priorities for resource use and different philosophies about cooperation versus competition during extended crisis conditions. Managing the internal conflicts required as much attention as preparing for external threats. My role evolved from technical consultant to strategic advisor, as coalition leadership relied increasingly on my analysis of intelligence reports, facility capabilities, and tactical options for defending our position. The same systematic approach I'd used for surveying projects was being applied to military planning and resource allocation decisions that affected hundreds of people across multiple communities. The measuring chains that had connected our small group during winter survival operations were now being used to coordinate defensive positions around a facility that had become the center of regional crisis management operations. My transit level, originally designed for property surveys, was now essential equipment for monitoring approaches and coordinating defensive fire during expected assault operations. Most significantly, my field notebooks had evolved from professional documentation to strategic intelligence that could determine the outcome of conflicts with implications far beyond our local area. The coordinates, structural assessments, and technical details I'd recorded during routine surveying work had become classified information that multiple groups considered worth fighting for. But the most important discovery during our 4th week of facility operations came when we accessed encrypted communication channels that revealed the true scope of the preparation that had preceded the volcanic eruption. The government's advanced knowledge wasn't based on geological monitoring alone. Intelligence agencies had received information about planned timing for the eruption from sources that weren't identified in the documentation we could access. The volcanic eruption wasn't entirely natural. It had been triggered deliberately, using technology and expertise that suggested coordination between government agencies and private organizations, with capabilities that exceeded anything in the public record. The crisis we'd been surviving wasn't just disaster response. It was implementation of a predetermined plan for social and economic restructuring during conditions that had been created intentionally. This revelation completely changed our understanding of the territorial conflicts, resource competition, and organizational struggles we'd been experiencing. We weren't just dealing with natural disaster aftermath. We were participants in a massive social experiment designed to test different approaches to crisis management and resource control under conditions of artificial scarcity and infrastructure breakdown. The groups fighting for control over government facilities weren't just seeking survival resources. They were competing for authority over the implementation of reconstruction policies that would determine how American society was reorganized during the recovery period. Our successful defense of the facility meant we were now responsible for making decisions that could affect the direction of social development for years to come. The intelligence we'd gained access to included documentation about similar operations in other countries, suggesting that the artificial crisis wasn't limited to North America. International cooperation was being deliberately prevented to ensure that each region's reconstruction would proceed according to different experimental models. The global implications were staggering and completely beyond anything our small group had imagined when we broke into the Boulder Public Library to survive the winter. On January 15th, we received intelligence that forced us to make the most important strategic decision since capturing the government facility. The coordinated assault by hostile groups was scheduled to begin within 72 hours, but we also received communication from federal agencies offering to negotiate resource-sharing agreements and territorial recognition in exchange for cooperation with official crisis management programs. The choice represented our final opportunity to determine our role in the larger conflicts that were reshaping American society during the extended crisis. We could attempt to defend our independent position against overwhelming military assault. We could negotiate integration into official government programs that would provide security but require surrender of autonomy. Or we could attempt to coordinate with other independent groups to establish alternative territorial arrangements that rejected both hostile takeover and government control. My surveying expertise had brought us to this decision point, but the choice itself required political and moral judgments that went far beyond technical analysis. The coordinates in my notebooks had given us access to intelligence that revealed the artificial nature of the crisis. But using that knowledge would require taking sides in conflicts that would determine the future of American society for generations. The boundary lines I'd spent my career measuring had led to mapping the boundaries between different visions of how human communities should be organized during crisis conditions. Property surveying had prepared me for territorial analysis, but the territories we were now defining included competing ideas about democracy, resource distribution, individual rights, and community responsibility. As we prepared for what would likely be the final test of our independent survival, I realized that every measurement I'd ever taken had been preparation for decisions that would determine not just our group's fate, but the direction of social reconstruction in a world that would never return to the conditions we'd known before the volcanic winter began. The tools of my trade had become instruments for measuring the distance between different possible futures, and the calculations we made in the next 72 hours would determine which of those futures became reality for everyone depending on our choices. January 18th arrived with intelligence reports confirming that the coordinated assault would begin before dawn. 3 separate hostile groups had positioned themselves around our facility during the night, using approaches that my surveying records had documented, but that they'd apparently discovered through their own reconnaissance. The Denver group controlled the southern approach. The Colorado Springs organization had taken positions to the east, and the Cheyenne group was blocking our northern escape routes. The tactical situation was exactly what my worst-case planning had predicted. We were surrounded by forces with superior numbers, better equipment, and more combat experience than our coalition could match. But we also had advantages that our attackers didn't fully understand. My detailed knowledge of the facility's layout, the underground systems I documented during the original survey, and defensive positions that my reconnaissance had identified over the past month. Williams had accepted my recommendation to use the government facility's communication equipment for a final attempt at negotiation before the assault began. The radio conversation that followed revealed information that changed everyone's understanding of what we were really fighting for and why these groups were willing to risk everything to capture our position. The leader of the Denver group identified himself as Colonel Marcus Hayes, claiming to represent legitimate federal authority for crisis management in the Colorado region. According to Hayes, our coalition was occupying a classified government facility without authorization and preventing official agencies from coordinating essential emergency services. He demanded immediate surrender and transfer of all intelligence materials we'd accessed during our occupation. But Hayes' demands revealed that he knew specific details about the facilities, capabilities, and contents that suggested either official government connection or access to classified information from other sources. He knew about the communication networks, the resource databases, and the coordination protocols we'd discovered. Most importantly, he knew about the documentation proving that the volcanic eruption had been artificially triggered. Williams responded by challenging Hayes' authority and demanding proof of his official status. The conversation that followed exposed the reality that federal government continuity had broken down in ways that made competing claims of legitimate authority impossible to resolve. Multiple groups were claiming to represent official federal agencies, but none could provide verification that would satisfy the others. The real issue wasn't legal authority or proper procedures for crisis management. It was control over resources and intelligence that could determine the direction of social reconstruction during the extended recovery period. Our facility contained information and equipment that could influence how American society would be reorganized, and different groups had different visions for what that reorganization should accomplish. Hayes offered terms that would have integrated our coalition into his organization structure, with guarantees of protection and resource access in exchange for full cooperation with their crisis management programs. But his description of those programs revealed authoritarian approaches to resource distribution and territorial control that would eliminate the independence we'd fought to maintain. The conversation lasted 47 minutes and established that peaceful resolution was impossible. Hayes represented a vision of crisis recovery based on centralized control and hierarchical authority. Our coalition represented alternative approaches emphasizing local autonomy and cooperative resource sharing. The conflict was ideological as much as tactical, involving fundamental disagreements about how human communities should be organized during extended emergency conditions. When negotiations ended, we had 6 hours to prepare for an assault that would test every defensive advantage my surveying expertise could provide. The facility's layout, which I documented in detail during the original survey work, became the foundation for defensive positioning that could offset our disadvantages in numbers and equipment. Mike's electrical knowledge proved essential for understanding the facility's power systems and creating backup lighting for defensive operations. Janet's medical background helped us establish casualty treatment protocols and emergency care procedures for wounded personnel. Sarah's organizational skills coordinated logistics and communication during tactical preparations that would determine our survival. But the most important discovery came when I accessed sealed documentation in the facility's secure storage areas. Using coordinates from my original survey work, I located classified files that revealed the complete scope of the artificial crisis program and the competing organizations involved in implementing different experimental approaches to social reconstruction. The documentation confirmed that the Yellowstone eruption had been triggered using technology developed through classified research programs. The timing had been coordinated to coincide with predetermined preparations for crisis management that different organizations had been developing for years. The volcanic winter wasn't just disaster response. It was implementation of a massive social experiment designed to test alternative models for reorganizing American society under controlled crisis conditions. Multiple organizations had participated in the planning, but they had different objectives for what the reconstruction should accomplish. Some groups advocated centralized federal control with extensive authority over resource distribution and territorial organization. Others supported regional autonomy with cooperative arrangements between independent communities. A third category promoted corporate management of reconstruction with private control over essential resources and services. The conflicts we'd been experiencing weren't just territorial disputes between survivor groups. They were implementation of competing reconstruction models, with different organizations attempting to establish the political and economic systems that would govern American society during the recovery period. Our successful defense of the government facility represented victory for approaches emphasizing local autonomy and cooperative resource management. Most importantly, the documentation revealed that international monitoring organizations were evaluating the effectiveness of different reconstruction models being tested in various regions. The experimental results would influence decisions about crisis management and social organization in other countries that were experiencing similar artificially induced emergency conditions. Our small group's survival decisions had become part of strategic calculations with global implications. The surveying expertise that had brought us to this position was now being used to analyze intelligence that could affect the direction of social development across multiple continents. At 4:30 in the morning on January 19th, the coordinated assault began with precisely the tactical approach my defensive planning had anticipated. The three hostile groups attacked simultaneously from different directions, using overwhelming force to prevent our defenders from concentrating resistance at any single point. But they'd underestimated the advantages provided by my detailed knowledge of the facility's layout and the defensive positions I'd established using underground access routes they didn't know existed. The measuring chains that had connected our group during winter survival operations became coordination devices for maintaining communication between defensive positions during the complex building-to-building fighting that followed. My transit level, positioned in the facility's observation tower, provided real-time intelligence about enemy movements and tactical coordination for our defensive response. Most significantly, the underground access tunnels I documented during the original survey became the foundation for counterattack operations that surprised our attackers and disrupted their tactical plans. The same precision that had defined property boundaries was now being used to define combat zones and coordinate defensive fire with accuracy that offset our disadvantages in equipment and numbers. The fighting lasted 7 hours and resulted in casualties on both sides, but our defensive advantages proved decisive. Hayes' forces were eventually forced to withdraw after failing to capture the facility's critical systems or access the intelligence databases they'd been seeking. The victory established our coalition as the legitimate authority for crisis management in the Boulder region and demonstrated that independent survivor communities could successfully resist takeover by more powerful organizations. But the real significance of our successful defense became clear during the following weeks, when we received communication from survivor groups throughout the region who had been monitoring our radio transmissions during the assault. Communities that had been struggling with isolation and resource scarcity were inspired by our example of successful resistance and began requesting assistance with their own defense and organization efforts. My surveying expertise became essential for analyzing intelligence about other communities and developing strategies for mutual assistance and resource sharing that could strengthen the entire network of independent survivor groups. The coordinates and technical knowledge in my notebooks were now being used to plan regional cooperation that could provide alternatives to both government control and corporate management of reconstruction efforts. The communication equipment we controlled provided contact with similar independent networks in other states, revealing that our successful model was being replicated across multiple regions. Survivor communities throughout the volcanic impact area were establishing cooperative arrangements that emphasized local autonomy and resource sharing, rather than centralized control or competitive territorial organization. Within 2 months of our successful defense, we'd established communication and cooperation agreements with independent communities throughout Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and surrounding states. The network represented thousands of survivors who were committed to reconstruction approaches that prioritized community self-determination and cooperative resource management over hierarchical authority and centralized control. My role evolved from tactical consultant to strategic coordinator for regional development planning that affected resource distribution, territorial organization, and cooperation protocols across multiple states. The same systematic analysis I'd used for property surveying was being applied to coordination between communities with different capabilities, resources, and priorities for long-term development. The measuring tools that had defined legal boundaries during my professional career were now being used to establish cooperative agreements between communities that were creating alternative models for social organization during the extended recovery period. Property lines had been replaced by cooperation zones, territorial boundaries, and resource sharing agreements that emphasized mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage. Most importantly, we demonstrated that local expertise and community cooperation could successfully resist attempts at external control and establish viable alternatives to the centralized management models being imposed in other regions. The intelligence we'd gained about the artificial nature of the crisis had become the foundation for reconstruction policies that prioritized community autonomy and democratic participation in decisions about recovery priorities. By March 15th, our regional network included 47 independent communities with combined population of over 12,000 survivors. The cooperation agreements we'd established provided resource sharing, mutual defense, communication coordination, and joint planning for long-term reconstruction projects that would determine how the region developed during the recovery period. The government facility we controlled had become the coordination center for the largest independent survivor network in the volcanic impact region. The intelligence databases and communication equipment were being used to support community development projects, resource distribution planning, and cooperation between groups with different capabilities and priorities. My surveying records had evolved into comprehensive documentation of regional resources, infrastructure, and development opportunities that guided reconstruction planning with the same precision I'd used for property assessment during my professional career. The boundary lines I was now mapping defined cooperation zones between communities rather than ownership divisions between competing interests. But the most significant accomplishment was proving that alternatives to centralized crisis management were not only possible but more effective for maintaining community viability and democratic participation during extended emergency conditions. The experimental models being tested in our region were producing better outcomes for survivor welfare, resource efficiency, and social stability than the authoritarian approaches being implemented elsewhere. International monitoring organizations had begun requesting detailed reports about our reconstruction methods and community organization strategies. The successful model we developed was being studied for potential implementation in other regions and countries that were experiencing similar crisis conditions. Today, on day 127 since the Yellowstone eruption, I'm speaking to you from the Coordination Center that has become the foundation for regional reconstruction efforts across multiple states. The measuring tools that once defined suburban property lines are now being used to map cooperation agreements between communities that are rebuilding American society according to principles of local autonomy and democratic participation. The surveying expertise that brought our small group to this position has become the foundation for strategic planning that affects thousands of survivors across the entire volcanic impact region. The precision and systematic analysis that defined my professional career are now being applied to coordination between communities that are creating alternatives to the centralized management models that other organizations tried to impose during the crisis. My field notebooks, which started as documentation of routine property surveys, now contain intelligence about regional resources, community capabilities, and cooperation opportunities that guide reconstruction decisions, with implications for how American society will be organized during the recovery period. The coordinates that once marked legal boundaries now define the territories where democratic communities are proving that local expertise and cooperative resource management can provide better outcomes than hierarchical authority and competitive territorial control. The boundary lines I've spent my career measuring have led to mapping the territories where human communities are demonstrating that crisis conditions can strengthen rather than weaken democratic participation and community cooperation. Property surveying prepared me for the territorial analysis that has become essential for regional reconstruction planning. But the territories we're now defining represent different visions of how human societies can organize themselves to ensure everyone's survival and welfare during extended emergency conditions. The tools of my trade have become instruments for measuring the distance between different possible futures. And the calculations we've made during these 127 days have determined that communities emphasizing cooperation and local autonomy can not only survive extended crisis conditions, but can use those conditions to create more democratic and sustainable approaches to social organization than existed before the volcanic winter began. The ice age isn't over, but neither are we. And that's the most precise measurement I've ever taken.